In 1890, William James wrote that the nervous system grows to the modes in which it has been exercised. He did not know about synapses. He had never heard of long-term potentiation. The concept of neuroplasticity was more than a century in the future. And yet the claim he was making, that repeated experience physically reshapes the neural substrate of behavior, is now one of the best established findings in neuroscience. How did he know? The short answer is that James was an extraordinarily careful observer of what was actually happening in the minds and behavior of human beings, and the things that actually happen in the mind and behavior of human beings are ultimately grounded in the structure and function of the brain. You do not need brain scanning equipment to notice that repeated practice makes behavior more automatic and less effortful. You need only to watch carefully. James watched carefully, and he drew the obvious inference. Whatever is happening in the brain must be changing in some way when behavior becomes habitual, because something physically must account for the change. The subsequent century of neuroscience has simply filled in the mechanism. The same pattern appears across his major contributions. His claim that emotional experience involves the perception of bodily states was attacked for decades as naive. Then Antonio Damasio, working with patients who had damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, showed that these patients, who were intellectually intact but had lost the connection between body states and emotional processing, were unable to make reasonable decisions in their daily lives. The body was informing the brain in ways crucial to rational function. This was the James Lange theory, confirmed by neurological evidence. His analysis of attention, specifically his distinction between voluntary attention and the neural effort it requires, has been confirmed and extended by decades of research on the prefrontal cortex and executive function. The prefrontal cortex is the brain region most associated with voluntary, top-down attentional control, with the ability to maintain focus on a chosen target in the face of competing stimuli. Damage to prefrontal regions produces exactly the kind of attentional dysregulation that James described as the failure of voluntary attention: impulsivity, distractibility, inability to sustain goal-directed behavior. James did not know the prefrontal cortex was doing this work. He described the psychological phenomenon that the prefrontal cortex instantiates. The connections to modern psychotherapy are equally striking. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the most empirically validated psychological treatment available, is built on the premise that changing patterns of thought and behavior changes emotional experience, that what we attend to, what we interpret situations as meaning, and how we respond to our own thoughts has direct consequences for how we feel. This is deeply Jamesian. James argued for this relationship between attention, interpretation, behavior, and emotional experience in 1890, when professional psychotherapy barely existed. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed in the 1990s and now one of the most widely used treatments for depression and anxiety, is essentially a formalization of practices that James described as important psychological exercises: the deliberate training of voluntary attention, the cultivation of non-judgmental awareness of present experience, the development of the metacognitive ability to observe one's thoughts without being swept away by them. James understood why these practices worked. He simply did not have the clinical infrastructure to formalize them as therapeutic protocols. The recent explosion of research on the default mode network, the brain network most active during mind-wandering, self-referential thinking, and the kind of rumination that characterizes depression, is also strongly connected to Jamesian ideas. James described the stream of consciousness as running on, with or without our attention, in the background of our mental lives. The default mode network is, in some sense, the neural substrate of that background stream. Research on how meditation affects default mode network activity, reducing unhelpful rumination while preserving adaptive self-reflection, is essentially neuroscientific work on the consequences of the attentional training James recommended. James was right about so much not because he was a prophet but because he was an honest observer. The mind is the mind. The brain is the brain that instantiates the mind. What you see when you look carefully at one should be consistent with what you find when you look carefully at the other. James looked carefully at the mind. Neuroscience looks carefully at the brain. After more than a century, they are still saying largely the same things. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.